Thank you for joining me for this PCTN practice assessment walkthrough. Before we start to have a look at the practice assessment on the AAT website, I just wanted to share some information with you with regards to preparing for the exam. So before you sit your exam, I'm sure that you will all have passed all of the assignments for Principles of Costing, including at least one of the practice assessments, one of the tutor mark practice assessments. As part of your revision, do revisit any questions where you've made errors in those assessments. It's not really enough simply to read through the feedback. You want to know that actually you have absorbed that feedback and you've now been able to modify your previous attempt. So do have another look at those questions where you've made errors. Make sure that you now feel confident in those areas. You can review the webinar recordings. So we have a series of 3 webinars. If you've not previously watched those, if you didn't join in with a live session, then do have a look at those webinar recordings. They are available through MyPTA. Please review the AAT examiner's performance feedback report. The examiners review the performance of everybody in the exam over the previous 12 months. And their report highlights where people have done well, where people have done less well. And they give you some valuable tips on how to succeed in each of the tasks. So it's definitely worth a read through. Please make sure that you attempt the green light tests and the practice assessments on AAT. There are a number of different resources on the Lifelong Learning portal on your MyAAT account. So do make sure that you work through all of those. We'll have a look at those very briefly in a moment. And then finally, please contact your tutor if you need any help and support at all. If you're not sure about anything, then please let us know. So with regards to the exam, on the day itself, the exam is an hour and a half long and will consist of 7 separate tasks. Depending on whether or not you sit your exam at a centre or whether or not you sit remotely, will determine when your results are available. So if you sit at a centre, your exam results will be available within 24 hours. If you sit remotely, it takes a little bit longer. It's still an auto-marked exam, but it just takes a little bit longer for those results to be verified. So at the moment, results are taking 10 days through remote invigilation. That timescale might well improve as the AAT get further along the road with remote invigilation. But at the moment, it takes 10 days for those results to come through. Calculators are permitted, so we definitely want you to use a calculator in your exam. If you're sitting at an exam centre, please make sure the exam is non-programmable, so it's not a calculator where you can previously have stored data. If you're sitting remotely, you will be using the on-screen calculator that is within the exam software. We'll have a look at that in a moment. Please make sure that you take a pen and ask for scrap paper if you're sitting your exam at an exam centre, or you can use the on-screen notes facility within the remotely invigilated exam if you prefer. It's definitely helpful to make notes as you go along. Please make sure that you read the question and data provided very carefully. I know that sort of almost goes without saying, but I've said it anyway. Read the question through all the way to the end. Have a look at the data that's been provided, read through that. And then in this exam, a lot of the questions are set in a tabular format. So have a look at the table where you're going to be entering the data. Look at the column headings. They will definitely guide you on what's required. Please make sure that you follow instructions exactly. Now, this is particularly important in this exam. Some questions you will be asked to enter your answers to 2 decimal places. In other questions, you're entering your figures to whole numbers. So it's important that you follow those instructions carefully. Remember, this is an auto-marked exam. So what the computer sees is what will be marked. Please make sure you double check your calculations. It takes seconds to put a calculation through your calculator twice. So it's definitely worth double checking every calculation that you do. Accuracy is of the utmost importance. Please make sure that you use all of the time allowed. And finally, do answer every question, even if you're not 100% sure, even if you think, actually, I've got no idea what they mean by that, please just put something down. There's a chance you will pick up a mark. If you don't put anything down, you definitely won't pick up any marks. So we're now going to move on to the AAT Lifelong Learning Portal. So log into MyAAT and then navigate to the Lifelong Learning Portal or through the link that takes you through to the practice material for each of the AAT units. I'm going to highlight the revision resources that are available to you, and then we're going to take a walk through the practice assessment. I've logged into MyAAT and navigated to the Lifelong Learning Portal and the Principles of Costing unit. I just want to give you a quick run through of the resources that are available in this Principles of Costing unit for revision. So there are some e-learning modules on a variety of topics. There are some key calculations for 2 inventory valuation methods and cost behaviour. There are a few videos there: cost behaviour, inventory control policy, and the similarities and differences of total and unit costs. There's a real life scenario. The real life scenario is an e-learning module, but it's set in, as it said, a real life scenario. So it's set in a business, and it puts the topics and the questions that you've covered within principles of costing in a real life context. So it's quite a nice bit of revision that you can do for that. Green light tests are topic specific, so they don't cover everything within the Principles of Costing syllabus, but they do cover costing for materials, labour and overheads, budget and variance analysis, and cost identification. This will generate different questions each time you go into it, so it's definitely a useful resource to attempt. We've got our practice assessments, which we'll look at in a second. The examiner report, you will probably have received a copy of this along with your practice assessment feedback from your tutor. If not, it's definitely worth coming and having a look at it here. The chief examiner looks at the performance in the assessment over the last 12 months and reports on it on a task-by-task basis. So they'll look at things that students did well, they'll look at things where students didn't do quite so well, and they'll make some suggestions as to how the performance on those tasks could be improved. So it's definitely worth reading through. It also gives you the heads up as to what's going to be tested in each task. That brings us to the practice assessments. You'll notice that there is a section here that says Remote Invigilation Generic Practice Assessments. What this is here for is it's to give you a chance to see what the remote invigilation environment looks like before you actually sit the assessment. It doesn't actually contain a Principles of Costing assessment. It is generic. So if we just have a quick look at this, if you are thinking of sitting your exam remotely, then it's definitely worth having a look at this. So all it does really is just gives you the general information about the assessment, but it also gives you some additional information with regards to the features that are available within the remote invigilation environment. So it tells you here that there is a space for rough workings. So it can be accessed by clicking on the whiteboard at the top of the secure browser. Now, obviously, we're not in the secure browser environment here. You'll only be in that when you're actually in the assessment itself. But there will be a tab which you can click on, and there will be a whiteboard onto which you can make notes. Doesn't count towards anything, doesn't count towards the marking. It's just somewhere that you can use just to help you, for example, to keep track of calculations. So you will be able to use that in the live assessment rather than a pen and a piece of paper as you would do at the exam centre. You will be using a built-in calculator throughout the remote invigilated assessments. You can access that through tools at the top of the screen. So if you click on that, it opens up a calculator. It is a scientific calculator. If you click on the little drop-down arrow, it simplifies the calculator for you. I do recommend that you have a practice with this before the assessment itself, just to get you get used to using that on-screen calculator. There are some notes there with regards to using the calculator as well. So really, the rest of this assessment isn't particularly useful for us for principles of costing. As I said, it's generic. I think it's one of the bookkeeping units that it's assessing here. So you don't need to actually do the assessment. It's just so you can become familiar with the environment. So we're going to just close that down now, come out of that, and go into the practice assessments for principles of costing. So today I'm going to take you through the principles of costing practice assessment 2. Just a note really about using these practice assessments. I'm sure you're all used to using the practice assessments by now, particularly if you've already done the bookkeeping units. You will already know that the practice assessment mimics the exam in the sense that once you've clicked finish, everything just disappears from screen. And all you are given then is a brief summary of how you've done. It doesn't give you the opportunity to go back and review your answers against the mark scheme, against the model answers. So not necessarily that helpful in terms of revision. So you have a couple of options. You can either check each task as you go along against the mark scheme. Now, obviously, that will take you a little bit of time to do. So it's not necessarily that helpful if you're trying to do a timed practice. However, you can go into these practice assessments as many times as you need to. So, I wouldn't worry too much about the timing of things. The other alternative is to do a screen print or a screen grab of your answer, paste it into a Word document or into OneNote, and then you can then check those answers against the mark scheme once you finish the assessment. That's much more useful for revision purposes. Okay, so let's go into the practice assessment now. Always read through the assessment information at the start of every assessment. It is the information is unique to each assessment. So it tells us we've got an hour and a half to complete the assessment. There are 7 tasks. It tells us that each task is independent. We don't need to refer to our answers to previous tasks. Total marks for the assessment is 80. As per my advice earlier, please read every task carefully and make sure you understand what's required. Where the date's relevant, it's given in the task data. Obviously, dates are relevant when we're doing inventory valuations. Tells us that both minus signs and brackets can be used to indicate negative numbers unless the task instructions state otherwise. Always look out for these additional instructions with regards to number formats. They are very important. Tells us that you must use a full stop to indicate a decimal point, and you can, if you wish, use a comma to indicate a number in the thousands. However, you don't need to do that, it's up to you. And then it just tells us that we need to double click to enter values into a gap fill or cell within a table. Okay, just before we move on, you can change the contrast, you can change the appearance of this assessment. If you find reading black text on a white background difficult, then you can change the contrast at the top of the screen there. So, for example, we can change it to white text on a black background. This is something that I would have a play around with within the practice environment. You don't want to be messing around with the contrast on the day of your exam. So find what works for you, and then in the practice environment, and then obviously you can set that up in the exam itself. There are some keyboard shortcuts here. I don't use them. I confess I find it more difficult to navigate using the shortcuts than I do using the arrow keys or the index. So I don't tend to use that. But if you want to use that, then again, familiarise yourself with that beforehand. Once we click continue, the timer will start to count down. Okay, so it is worth keeping an eye on that timing. You've got 7 tasks and you've got an hour and a half. So it's worth having a rough idea of how long you will be spending on each task. So let's just do that. So we've got 90 minutes divided by 7 tasks. So that's roughly 12 minutes per task. Okay, some tasks you will complete much more quickly. Some tasks will probably take you longer than that. So it is really just a rough guide. Okay, let's make a start then. So we'll click continue. At the top of each task, it does tell you about what the task will be covering. So this task is about classification and relationship of costs. We're told that the task has parts A to B. Make sure you've completed all parts of the task before you move on to the next one. If you don't complete all parts of the task, I recommend that you flag the task as a and that will give you a reminder. If you look in the index, it shows if you flagged a task, and that's just a reminder that you need to go back to it. So let's take that flag off. So the first task is to identify whether the following statements are true or false. So the first statement, the role of financial accounting is to help with decision making, both internally and externally, using published financial results. So financial accounting, well, what do we know about financial accounting? Yes, we know it's about preparing published financial results. And yes, we know it's used externally. Could we use it to make decisions internally? Yes, I've no doubt that we could do. So we'll say that that statement is true. So financial accounting can be used to make decisions both internally and externally using published financial results. So the role of management accounting is to help with decision making externally using variance analysis and budgets prepared in advance. Okay, let's break that down. So management accounting, what do we know about management accounting? Well, yes, it will help with decision making, but it's internal decision making. People external to the business will not usually see the management accounts. So that statement isn't true. Variance analysis obviously is one of the activities of management accounting, as is preparing budgets. So whilst those parts of the statement do refer to management accounting, it's this external word that actually gives us the clue that this statement is false. Management accounting can incorporate much more than just monetary values, including hours, tons, litres and miles. Well, yeah, we know from the calculations that we've done in the unit that we're not just looking at monetary values, are we? We might want to look at, we might want to forecast the number of units that are going to be produced, and from there calculate how many hours labour will be required, how many hours machine time, how many tons or litres of material we will need to prepare those units. So definitely that statement is definitely true. Okay, we'll scroll down to part B. Here we're asked to identify the behaviour of the following costs, and we have a table with a description of the cost, and then we need to say whether we think that cost is fixed, variable or semi-variable. Now let's just have a look. Yeah, so we can only choose one option for each of these, which is what we would expect. Costs are either one thing or another. We can't have a combination. Unless semi-variable, which of course is a combination of both fixed and variable costs. So our first cost, electricity with a standing charge. Well, definitely the more units we produce, the more electricity will be needed. So yeah, electricity is definitely a variable cost. However, this says with a standing charge. Now, a standing charge is a time-based thing. It's not based on activity. That standing charge will be there regardless of whether any electricity is used. So that element, that standing charge element, is a fixed cost. So for that reason, electricity with a standing charge will be classed as a semi-variable cost. Annual subscription fees. So it tells us this cost is annual. It doesn't relate to activity. It's just a cost per year. So that will be classed as a fixed cost. It's not going to increase or decrease with activity. Production staff wages. Okay, well, we know if we produce more units, that will usually take more labour time. And that labour time usually increases in direct proportion to activity, or decreases in direct proportion to activity. So our staff wages for our production employees will be classed as a variable cost. Advertising is a day-to-day running cost of the business. It's one of our expenses. It doesn't relate to activity, so it doesn't relate to the number of units produced. So it will be classed as a fixed cost. Raw materials used in production. So a little bit like our labour costs. The more units we produce, the more material will be required. The less units we produce, the less material will be required. Our raw material cost will vary in direct proportion to the number of units produced or to activity. So that will be classed as a variable cost. Okay, so we can see we've reached the end of the task. We can see those words, end of task. So we can click on answer, which takes us on to task 2. Task 2 is about costing techniques. So we're required to identify whether the following statements refer to planning, control, or decision making. So these are the purpose of management accounting, aren't they? The purpose of management accounting is to help the business to plan, control, and make decisions about their activities. So we've got some statements, and we need to click on the option of either planning, control, or decision making. The act of making a choice based on information received. So if you're making a choice, that means you're making a decision about something. So that will be decision making. Forecasting at different activity levels. That is one of the ways that the business will plan its activities. And then finally, comparing budgeted results to actual results and then taking action is an example of control, of budgetary control. So that's that part answered. Moving on to part B. We're required to identify which inventory valuation method best describes the following statements. So we've got a number of statements and we need to say whether they refer to FIFO, LIFO, AVCO. So first in, first out, last in, first out, or average cost. So the first one, cost issues using the average inventory price. We can see the word average there, can't we? So we know immediately that this refers to our average cost method. So let's select that one. So the next one, as purchase prices rise, this method gives the highest profit. Okay, so I need to do some thinking about that. And when I think about things, I like to make notes about them just so I can put my thoughts into some order. So prices are rising. Okay, so FIFO, that costs issues using the oldest prices. So the issues uses the oldest prices first. So that means it will use the cheapest units first, doesn't it? So that means our cost will be lower. So that means profit will be higher. Okay, so yeah, if we're using the first in, first out method, that issues the oldest items first, doesn't it? If prices are rising, those oldest items will be the cheapest items. So that means our issue cost will be lower, which means our profit will be higher. So that means in closing inventory terms, the most recent items are what's still in inventory. So they are the most expensive items. Okay, So let's look at the statement again. As purchase prices rise, this method gives the highest profit. Okay, yeah, we can see that profit is higher under FIFO, so we'll select that. As purchase prices rise, this method gives the highest closing inventory valuation. Well, let's have a look. Yeah, closing inventory uses the recent more expensive prices. So yeah, that's right. It would give the highest closing inventory valuation. So we can also go for FIFO for that one. If you're not sure, I would do a similar work through with LIFO, just so I was sure. So LIFO issues the recent more expensive items first. Struggling to type here, expensive items first. So that means costs will be higher and profits lower. That means our closing inventory will be valued using the oldest, cheapest items. So our closing inventory will be a lower value, won't it? So yeah, I'm satisfied that it's FIFO for both of the options there. Okay, so I would use scrap paper and a pen if I was in the exam centre, just to make some notes. That just, as I said, it helps me to organise my thoughts. If you're in the remote environment, then you can use the whiteboard within that secure browser area. Okay, I'll leave that notepad on screen for a minute because we might need it again in a minute. So in part C, we need to identify which labour costing method is being used in the following scenarios. In scenario A, we can see production staff are paid for 35 hours a week at £17.50 per hour. Any additional time is paid at time and a half. Let's look at our table headings. We've got time rate plus overtime, we've got piecework, and we've got a guaranteed minimum payment. Well, we can see we've got a time rate being described here, haven't we? We can see the number of hours, the amount per hour, and we can see that there is an overtime rate there. So our scenario A is describing time rate plus overtime. Scenario B, on the other hand, describes production staff being paid £10 for each for each unit fully completed. So that's piecework, isn't it? But if we have a look, the rest of that statement says that at least £600 being paid at the end of each week. So that is describing a guaranteed minimum payment, isn't it? So although, yeah, there's a piecework element here, there is a guaranteed minimum payment. So that's going to be the option that we will tick here. It's not purely piecework. So moving on, we're told that 58 units were made in the week, taking the full 35 hours. We're asked to calculate the labour cost per unit for each of these scenarios and round our answers to 2 decimal places. So that vital piece of information there, round to 2 decimal places. So look at the table. It gives us scenario A and B, and it's asking for a labour cost per unit. I will confess, the first time I went through this, I merrily calculated the weekly wage. Okay, that's not what it's asking us for. It's asking us to work out the cost per unit. So do read the instructions very carefully. Okay, so let's just grab our notepad back up again. Let's get rid of those notes and have a look at this one. So under A, we need to work out the weekly wage first of all, and then we'll divide that by the number of units produced to find our cost per unit. So our weekly pay is 35 hours times £17.50. There was only 35 hours worked, so there's no overtime. So let's get our calculator up. So 35 times 17.50 gives us 612.50. So that's our cost per week. That's not what we're entering in the answer box. Okay, we need to work out what the cost per unit is. So if we take 612.50 and divide it by 58 units, That gives us a cost per unit. We can do that over here. 612.50 divided by 58 equals 10.560344, and so on. Now we want to give our answer to 2 decimal places, remember. So we'll look at the digit after the second decimal place, and that will tell us whether or not we need to round the answer up. Okay, in actual fact, the digit after our second decimal place is a 0, so no rounding is required there. We can enter our answer there as 10.56, rounded to 2 decimal places. Scenario B. Scenario B uses a guaranteed minimum payment. So we need to work out the same thing again. We need to calculate the weekly wage and then divide that by the number of units produced. So 58 units were produced at £10 per unit. So that gives us a weekly wage under piecework of £580. However, we can see that these employees are paid at least £600. So obviously they haven't made enough under piecework, so they will then receive £600 per week. So if we divide that £600 by the number of units produced, that gives us, let's calculate that out, that gives us £580 divided by, sorry, no, it doesn't, it's £600, isn't it? Let's just clear that. £600 divided by 58 units equals 10.344827, and so on. So we'll round that to 2 decimal places. So the digit after our second decimal place is a 4. So obviously if it was a 5 and above, we would round the second digit up. It's not, it's below 5, so we will leave our answer there at £10.34. Okay, so that is task 2 completed. Just have a quick check, make sure we've answered everything, and then we can click answer and move on. Task 3 is about recording costs, and it consists of parts A to C. So part A, we need to identify how the following costs are classified. So we've got some cost descriptions there, and we've got the classification method. So which classification method uses these types of costs? Let's have a look what we've got in the drop down. So we've got nature, function, element, and behavior. Direct and indirect costs is where we classify costs by nature. If we break our costs down between materials, labour, and overhead, we are looking at classifying our cost by element. Fixed, variable, and semi-variable costs is describing the behaviour of costs. That is the classification by behaviour. And finally, categorising or classifying costs by department is what we do when we classify costs by function. In part B, we need to identify whether the following are advantages or disadvantages of coding systems. So with a code, we assign the cost or the revenue with a code, don't we, rather than using the full description, either an alphanumeric or a purely numeric code. So yes, coding systems, does mean that we can retrieve information easily and quickly. So that's definitely an advantage of it. However, it can be easy to use the wrong code if you're not familiar with a coding system, or if it's a random code that's used, doesn't actually to relate to the cost that's being coded, then yeah, it can be easy to miscode a bill. So we'd say that is a disadvantage of the coding system. In the next part of the task, we're told that an accountancy practice sells various services to its range of clients. It uses an alphanumeric coding system in order to code its sales invoices as follows. So we can see we have codes relating to the location of the client, codes relating to the client themselves, and then the type of sale. So it looks like the type of service that's being provided for the client. So we're asked to code the following sales transactions using the coding system provided above. So we can see that these are all sales transactions. They've helpfully given us the code for the first one. So we can see how that works. Completion by Bristol office. So it starts with BO for client A. So client A uses 001 and year-end accounts have been prepared. So it's YE. So we need to do the same thing now for the second one. So completion by East Anglian office. So that's an EO code. Be careful. I really wanted to put EA there, the East Anglian. It's not, it's EO. You'll notice all of those location codes are BO, EO, DO. Bristol office, East Anglia office. Just be careful. So it's for client C, so it's 003. And it's for preparing the VAT return, so VR. And then completion by Devon office, so DO for the Devon office for client B, so 002. And then bookkeeping, which is BK. Now I would imagine, I'm just looking at that client bit there, it would be so easy. I'm thinking about client B there. So, it's very tempting to put a letter down there, but it's not. We need to put the number that represents that client. So just have a quick look through those again. Is that right? Client C, VAT return. This is the sort of thing that it's easy to just make an error on. So it's definitely worth just double checking the accuracy before you move on from this. Okay, we've reached the end of the task. So we can move on now and look at the next task. Task 4 is about calculating overhead absorption rates and looking at the behaviour of costs. Task A actually looks at the behaviour of costs first of all. We're given some statements there and we've got some buttons there and we need to say whether or not these costs are fixed or variable. So we're asked to identify whether the following statements relate to fixed or variable costs. So the first statement, unit cost remains the same with changes in activity levels. Is that describing a fixed or a variable cost? I know it's saying that it stays the same, but remember it's talking about unit cost here. Think back to the example that we've used in the webinars of a bakery producing a loaf of bread. Each loaf of bread takes 1 kilo of flour. Let's say that kilo of flour costs £1. The next loaf of bread that you make will also use 1 kilo of flour costing £1. And the third loaf of bread will use 1 kilo of flour costing £1. So the unit cost will remain the same with changes in activity levels. The total cost will, of course, increase with activity. If you make 3 loaves of bread, the cost will be £3. If you make 1 loaf of bread, the cost will be £1. But at unit cost, the cost remains the same. So that is describing a variable cost. Unit cost varies with changes in activity levels. So again, it's describing unit cost there, not total cost. We know that some costs do not change with activity. The total cost does not change with activity. However, the more units we produce, the lower the unit cost will be because that cost is being shared out. So unit cost will change. It will vary with a fixed cost. So that second statement is describing a fixed cost. So just take care with anything relating to cost behaviour. Check, is it talking about unit cost? Is it talking about total cost? Because when we describe a cost as being variable, we're actually describing the total cost that varies. When we're describing a cost as being fixed, we're describing the total cost as being fixed. The way the cost per unit behaves is obviously the opposite of that. The next part of the task, we've got some calculations to do. We have a business here called Barrymore Limited who produce a single product of which the following budgets have been identified. Overheads are £95,000. We have an activity level of 2,500 units, so that's the number of units that are being produced, and they take 3,000 labour hours. The business is looking to identify how the different budgeted overhead absorption rates affect unit cost. If they used machinery instead of labour, the budgeted machine hours are 2,000. So 2,000 machine hours if the units are produced by machine. We're asked to complete the table below to show what the budgeted overhead cost per unit would be at 3 different budgeted overhead absorption rates. And we're told to enter all values to 2 decimal places. Let's look at this table then. So we've got the overhead absorption method on each row, the number of units or hours that relate to that method. So there's 2,500 units produced, or 3,000 labour hours, or 2,000 machine hours. We then need to calculate the hours per unit, the budgeted overhead absorption rate for each method, and the budgeted overhead cost per unit for each method. So how many hours does it take to make each unit? Well, we don't need to know that for the per unit basis, but for labour hour, how many hours per unit? Okay, so it tells us that there are 3,000 hours taken to make 2,500 units. So if we divide 3,000 hours by 2,500 units, that gives us that means it takes 1.2 hours to produce each unit. Remember, we need to put our answers into 2 decimal places. So if I just put that in, which is what my calculator has given me, that's not to 2 decimal places, is it? So I must remember to put a 0 after it, 1.20. We can then go on and calculate the hours per unit if the production was done by machine rather than by labour. So there's 2,000 machine hours divided by 2,500 units. That means for each unit, it will take 0.8 of a machine hour to make it. Again, let's be careful when we enter this. Our answer must be to 2 decimal places, so we need to put 0.80 in there for our hours per unit. Next thing to do is to calculate the budgeted overhead absorption rate. So the budgeted overhead absorption rate is calculated as our budgeted overheads divided by our budgeted activity. Okay, so just a reminder there of that. If you've got any formulas that you have memorised, it might help you to jot them down just so you can refer to them when you're doing any calculations. So the budgeted overhead absorption rate, that's what we're calculating. So per unit, we know that there are £95,000 worth of overhead, and we're going to divide that by the budgeted activity. So the budgeted activity is the number of units we budget to produce for this method. So 95,000 divided by 2,500 units gives us an overhead absorption rate of £38 per unit. Remember our 2 decimal places. The overhead absorption rate on a labour hour basis will see us dividing our overheads again by the number of labour hours it takes we have available. Labour hours are 3,000, aren't they? Divided by 3,000 gives us an overhead absorption rate of 31.6666 recurring. We need to round this to 2 decimal places, so we'll look at that third digit. That's above 5, isn't it? So that means we're going to round up to 2 decimal places. So the answer will be £31.67, £31.67. And then our final budgeted overhead absorption rate is per machine hour. So £95,000, our overheads, divided by our activity, which is 2,000 hours. We've got that in our table, haven't we? 2,000 hours. So that means that the overhead absorption rate on a machine hour basis is £47.50, £47.50. In the final column, we are asked to calculate the budgeted overhead cost per unit. That's nice and simple. For our per unit method, we've already done it, haven't we? We've already worked out the overhead cost per unit, so we can enter that in. On a per labour hour basis, it takes 1.2 hours to make 1 unit. So we would expect to absorb more than 1 hour's worth of overhead. So we need to multiply our overhead absorption rate by the number of hours it takes to make 1 unit. So it takes 1.2 hours to make 1 unit, and our overhead absorption rate per hour is 31.67. So rounded to 2 decimal places. We don't round there, do we? Because the number, our third digit there is below 5. So our budgeted overhead cost per unit is again £38. And then our last one, the budgeted overhead cost per unit, it takes less than an hour to make, it takes less than 1 machine hour to make a unit of product. So that means we'll be absorbing less than an hour's worth of overhead into each unit. Let's do that calculation again. So 0.8, which is the number of hours it takes to make number of hours machine time it takes to make 1 unit, multiplied by our budgeted overhead absorption rate per machine hour, times by 47.50, gives us £38 again, £38 to 2 decimal places. It's the same overhead cost per unit here because there's only 1 product being produced. So all of the overheads will be absorbed into those products, regardless of the method of overhead absorption. That's not always going to be the same if a business produces more than 1 range of products. We've reached the end of the task, so we can move on. Task 5 is about calculating costs of products and using tools and techniques to improve the presentation of information. This is one of our spreadsheet tasks. Okay, you'll see if we scroll down, we've got something set up in a spreadsheet format. So we know task 5, using tools and techniques basically means using spreadsheets. We're told that Fred Company Limited manufacture electric bicycles and are reviewing the cost of sales for its latest product, the Elite. We're asked to complete the calculation of direct costs by selecting from each drop-down list in the table below, ensuring that each item is in the correct order as identified in the manufacturing account. So we need to remember the order of the manufacturing account. We're given some figures. So we don't need to worry about numbers at the moment. We're purely thinking about those headings in the manufacturing account. So direct costs. Now the direct costs of the business are the costs that make the products, aren't they? They're the costs that relate to the units of production. So we obviously have some material included in there. So let's look at our drop down. Okay, so if we have got raw materials in inventory, we're going to be using those up, aren't we? So we'll start off with our opening inventory of raw materials. Next comes the purchase of raw materials. And then we need to remove any raw materials that are still in inventory at the end of the period, because clearly they can't form part of our cost of sale. If they're still in inventory, they've not been used. So we will take out our closing inventory of raw materials. Just be careful with these drop downs. They're not necessarily in the order that you expect them to be. They're not alphabetical. And they're not in the order that they're going to appear in this table. So just make sure you've selected the right option. So opening inventory plus the purchase of raw materials minus the closing inventory of raw materials. What else is included in direct cost? Well, of course, we need labour, don't we, to make our units. So we can include direct labour there. So that gives us a direct cost total of £175,000. So that's our manufacturing, or the top part of our manufacturing completed, the direct cost part of our manufacturing account. Let's scroll down a bit more. You've been given the following information. So we now have some more costs that we need to include in our manufacturing account. And we're told this information can also be viewed in the references section to the right. So if we pop into references, if you can see, we've got task 5 part B, which is what we're working on, and that has given us the same information as we've got on the screen there, but it means that we can scroll up and down and we can leave that information to the side there where we can see it, which will be useful if we need to do calculations rather than scrolling up and down. What do we need to do with this information? Well, we're told in B1 to calculate the costs in the table below. Show your answers to the nearest whole pound. There we go, a different instruction now with regards to number formats. We're entering our figures to whole pounds now. We're told do not use spreadsheet formulas when entering your answers. So although this is set up to look like a spreadsheet, we're not entering any formulas here. We're doing the calculations on our calculator and entering figures into this spreadsheet. We've then got a series of tasks about formatting the information in the table, in the spreadsheet. We'll have a look at that in a moment. Let's get the calculations done first of all. So calculate the costs in the table below. So we can see in our spreadsheet, we have our manufacturing account. It starts off with the direct materials used. Well, we've partially calculated that earlier on. It's got the total direct cost, and then we need to work out manufacturing cost, costs of goods manufactured, and cost of goods sold. Okay, so although I've just said opening the references section will avoid having to do scrolling, actually because we've already calculated direct materials used in part A, we need to go back up there and have a look at what those direct materials are. Actually, when I said we calculated them, we didn't. We put them into the table, didn't we? We didn't actually calculate the total direct materials used. So let's do that now. Let's get our calculator up. So our direct material cost will consist of 75,000 opening inventory, plus our purchase of raw materials, minus the closing inventory of raw materials, because these haven't been used. These materials haven't been used, so they're not going to form part of our direct material cost. So that gives us a direct material cost of 150,000. So let's just go and pop that in. There we go. We're then given the direct cost. So as we can see, that was already in our table, wasn't it? Direct cost, £175,000. That was entered for us. We don't need to do that. The next figure we need to look at is the manufacturing cost. So obviously the manufacturing cost is our direct costs plus the manufacturing overheads. So our manufacturing overheads are given in the table. We can probably do this without our calculator, but let's just put it through the calculator anyway. 175,000 plus 25,000 manufacturing overheads gives us our manufacturing cost of 200,000. Next, we need to calculate the cost of goods manufactured. So these are the units that have been produced in the month, plus the cost of any units that we've finished off that had been started in the previous period, minus any units that are incomplete. Obviously, if the units are incomplete, they're not going to form part of our cost of sales. We can't have sold them, can't we? So we don't want to include the cost of those items. So the next part of our calculation is to take our manufacturing cost, add on our opening inventory of work in progress, and subtract the closing inventory of work in progress. So the cost of goods manufactured is 190,750. Finally, we can calculate the cost of goods sold. As with work in progress, there will be some items, some finished items that are sold in this period that had actually been completed in an earlier period. So that will be our opening inventory of finished goods. But there will also be some finished goods that are unsold. So we want to take the cost of those out of the calculation of our cost of sales. So let's get our calculator up again. Be careful with this table. It's given, the information is given in no particular order. It's all a bit jumbled up. So just make sure that you're picking up the right figures. So we'll start off with our cost of goods manufactured, 190,750. I guess I could have left that figure in. We're going to add on our opening inventory of finished goods. So add on 59,250. And then subtract from that the closing inventory of finished goods. So 63,000. It's 187,000. Okay, so we've completed B1. We now need to do B2, 3, 4, and 5. So we're going to use the simulated spreadsheet to help us to format the data in the table. You can scroll to the right here, obviously. In fact, let's just shut down those references now so we can see the full menu bar there now, the full ribbon, as it would be called in Excel. So part 2, place a 3px border around the table heading cells A1 to B1. I confess, when I first looked at this, I wasn't 100% sure what a PX border was. However, I looked at my borders, I looked at the border icons. These are the border icons here. And if you have a look at the drop down next to it, can you see we have an option for a 3px solid black? I'm guessing 3px is the weight of the line. So let's highlight the cells that we want that border to go around. Okay, we want a 3px border around the table heading. So the table headings is cells A1 and B1. So I've highlighted those. I can now put a border around those cells, a 3px solid black border. So can you see we've now got a dark border all around there. Part 3 is to format cells B4 to B6 with thousands separators. So B4 and B6, as you can see, actually, it cells B2 and B3 have already got the 1,000 column separator, 1,000 comma separator. We need to add that now to B4 to B6. We can highlight them all, and we're going to apply that formatting to all of those cells. So let's click next to format. Can we see there's a little drop down there that says number format? So if we click in the arrow there, we can see here that we have an option here for thousands. Okay. Not accounting. Okay, now, although accounting would give us a comma, can you see it gives us a pound sign and 2 decimal places? So that's not what it's asking for. It's just asking for 1,000 separator. Let's clear the format on those and let's put it back in again as thousands. So now our numbers look like the rest of the numbers in the table. There's just a 1,000 comma separator included. Next, we need to fill cell B6 with any colour. Your opportunity now to get a bit creative. So B6, let's go to the fill option, which is this little paint pot here. Open it up. You can put any colour you like, and I'm going to go for a nice bright purple. Okay, so I have filled cell B6 with colour, and then in Part 5, increase the text size of cell A1 to font size 20. So I'm going to go back to A1. I'm going to click into A1 there, and we can see the font size is here. It's currently set at 18px. If you have a look, if you hover over these options on the ribbon, it gives you, it tells you what actually most of these actually do. So that's quite a helpful feature. So we're changing the font size. So that's going to be in here, and I'm going to change it to 20, a 20-point size there. Okay, so I've finished now formatting my spreadsheet. Okay, so that's it. We can click answer and move on. It's worth having a look at the model answers just to see how these spreadsheet tasks are assessed and what's allowed and what's not allowed. Okay, so I'll definitely have a look at that. Task 6 is about labour and inventory calculations. The task has parts A to C. This task is relating to a business called Johnson Limited. Johnson Limited has made the following purchases and issues of raw material during the month of April. We can see that there are a series of dates, and we can see we've got some receipts there. The meters here have been purchased on the 5th, the 11th, the 22nd. On the 28th, there have been some issues. So those items, 15,000 meters, have been taken out of inventory and used in production. And then on the 30th of April, there's a further 4,000 meters have been purchased. So further receipt of 4,000 meters. We're asked to complete the table below for the cost of issue and closing inventory values to the nearest whole pound. So number formats again, we're looking at whole pounds now, not 2 decimal places. Be careful with this. Don't assume just because this particular practice asks you to do it for whole pounds that all of them will. It's not necessarily the case. So always look out for that number format. The next time we look at a similar question, it might be to 2 decimal places. Just take care with this. Now, what you'll notice here is that we haven't been given the inventory record card. So I would suggest that we make some notes as we go along through these calculations and almost replicate the store's record card. We don't need to do it in quite as much detail, but it will certainly help us to keep a record of these calculations. So on the 5th of April, £5,000 meters were purchased at £2. So the cost of those receipts, 5,000 at £2. I'm sure we can do that without the calculator, but let's open it up. 5,000 at £2 means that those receipts cost in total £10,000. On the 11th of April, 5,500 meters were purchased at £2.02. So 5,500 times £2.02 gives us a cost of our receipts there, 11,110. Then on the 22nd of April, 4,750 meters were purchased at a cost of £2.04. Just let me go back in and just put the time sign there, just so we can see what the calculations are that we've been doing. Okay, so that is at a cost of 4,750 times £2.04. So 9,690. Okay. At that point, on the 28th of April, 15,000 metres were issued to production. So we need to decide how those 15,000 metres are going to be valued. So we're valuing the cost of our issue. Okay, sorry, I should have said that we're looking here, we're doing notes here for FIFO. Okay, so label your calculations. So we're issuing 15,000 metres. Now that is going to be made up using the oldest items first. First in, first out. So we're going to be issuing these oldest items first. So we'll issue the 5,000 units at £2, costing £10,000. And we'll issue all 5,500 of the units that cost £2.02 at a total of 11,110. Now we're issuing 5,000 units and we've made up 10,500 of those units so far. So that means the remaining 4,400 units will be issued using the cost of £2.04. So we just need to recalculate that. We haven't got that calculation from before. Remember, we received 4,750 at £2.04, but we're only issuing 4,500 of those. Just so you can see how that works, we need to issue, there are 15,000 metres being issued. We've worked out the cost of 5,000 of them. We've worked out the cost of 5,500 of them. So that means we need to calculate the remaining 4,500. So the 4,500 will be at £2.04. So the issue cost of those is 9,180. So if we add together all of those figures, we will see that we've issued 15,000 units, 15,000 metres, sorry, at a cost of 9,180, 11,110 plus 10,000. So my cost of issue under FIFO is 3,290. So I can enter that into my table. 30,290 to whole pounds, no decimal places needed. So what's left? Okay, well, we know that all that's left is 250 units at £2.04. So 250 units at £2.04, because we've issued 5,000 at 2, 5,500 at £2.02, and 4,500 at £2.04. So there's only 250 units left at £2.04. So that's £510. Take care now. If you'll notice, there was a further receipt after the issue was made. We're doing our valuations for the month of April, so we need to make sure we include that receipt. So there is a further 4,000 units have been purchased at £2.05 per metre. So 4,000 metres times £2.05. The cost of that receipt is £8,200. So 8,200 plus 510 tells us there's 8,700 £8,710 left in inventory. So I can pop that into my closing inventory here. There is another way that we can work out closing inventory. We can add together all of the receipts and subtract the cost of issue. So let me just write that down. So we've got 10,000 plus 11,110 plus 9,690 minus the cost of issue, which was 30,290, plus the receipt for the on the 30th of April, which came to 8,200. That should come to the same figure as we've just calculated for closing inventory. So you can always do a double check. If you add together the cost of everything that you've received, subtract the cost of issue that you've calculated, that should come back to your closing inventory valuation if you didn't want to just work out which units were left in stock. Calculation is 10,000 plus 11,110 plus 9,690 minus 30,290 plus 8,200. So that marries up to the closing inventory value that we've already calculated. Okay, that's just an alternative way that you can calculate closing inventory. Okay, we're now going to do a similar set of calculations for AVCO, except because we've made a note of some of our calculations when we've calculated for FIFO, actually we've got less to do for AVCO. Some of these figures are already here. So the cost of issue on the 28th of April under AVCO, we've already worked out what the cost of our receipts are. All we need to do is total that. So we can total it here. Let's just copy that. 10,000, add 11,110, add 9,690. So that tells us the value of what we'd received before the issues were made. So there was £30,800 worth of inventory in stock, and there were, let's just work out the number of units. There was 5, and that was for 5,000 plus 5,500 plus 4,750. So that was the number of units in inventory when the issues were made. So to work out our average cost, we need to divide the total cost of inventory by the total number of units. Just get the total number of units first of all. So there was 15,250 units. So to work out the average cost of our issues, we'll divide the cost of our receipts divided by the number of meters or number of units that we've received, and then multiply that by the number of units issued, so 15,000. So what does that give us? Let's calculate that out. So 30,800 divided by 15,250 multiplied by 15,000 meters. So that gives us a issue value of 30,295. So let's pop that in, 30,295. Okay, still need to calculate we still need to calculate the closing inventory. So we know before the issues were made the inventory that was in stock was 30,800. And we know that we received a further 4,000 at £2.05, don't we? And we calculated the cost of that earlier on, so we put that in here. And then we can take away the cost of the issue that we've just calculated. Let's see what that gives us. £8,705. That's our closing inventory under AVCO. So although some of those notes perhaps appear quite complicated, what I'm trying to do here is to replicate the store's record card, the calculations that we would do on that store's record card. So working out the cost of receipts, and then the cost of issue using FIFO, so issuing the oldest items first gave us our cost of issue, and then working out what's left in inventory. So that will be the items that were received most recently under FIFO. And then for AVCO, we have added together all of our costs, the receipt costs, which we calculated earlier, and divided that by the number of units in inventory when the issues were made. And that's given us our cost of issue. Once we've done that, we can then add on we can take our opening inventory, add on the inventory that's received since the issues were made, so the issues that were received on the 30th of April, and then subtract from that the issues. Continuing on, Johnson Limited are also looking at its inventory control policies. We're asked to identify whether the following statements are true or false. First statement, reducing buffer stock will help to reduce storage costs. So buffer stock is the stock that we keep just in case. It's to avoid stock outs. Or because we have perhaps had a special offer come through. We want to take advantage of that special offer. So buffer stock, if we reduce buffer stock, if we reduce the amount that we're holding just in case, that will definitely help to reduce storage costs. In times of changing prices, increasing buffer stock will help to stabilise the cost of inventory held. Well, yes, the more buffer stock that we have at the same price will certainly help to stabilise the cost of inventory held. That statement is true. Next one down then, Johnson Limited pays a time rate of £25 per hour to its direct labour workforce for a standard 35-hour week. It does not pay overtime in excess of the standard 35 hours. During this time, they are expected to produce 350 units. For any units in excess of this, they are paid an individual bonus of £2 per unit. There are 3 people in a team, and if all 3 exceed the 350 units each, there's also a team bonus of £60, which is divided equally between the members of the team. Team A all exceeded targets, however, Team B did not. So what do we need to do with that information? Well, we're asked to complete the table below, showing all values to the nearest whole pound. If your answer is 0, enter 0. So we can see we've got S. Roscoe and M. Cross. S. Roscoe works for Team A, M. Cross for Team B. S. Roscoe worked 36 hours, M. Cross 35. S. Cross made 365 units, M. Cross made 355. If we look at our table, it guides us through what we're being expected to do with the information, what we need to calculate. So we're asked to work out the basic wage, the individual bonus, and any team bonus. So basic wage. The key here is that this company does not pay overtime in excess of the standard 35-hour week. So regardless of the fact that S. Roscoe worked 36 hours, they are only going to get paid for 35. So 35 hours times £25 per hour gives us a basic wage of £875. Whole numbers here, we don't need to put 2 decimal places. Will S. Roscoe earn a bonus? Let's have a look. They produced 365 units. The bonus is paid. Here we go. During this time, they're expected to produce 350 units. Any units in excess of this, they are paid an individual bonus of £2 per unit. So S. Roscoe produced 365 units. The target was 350. The standard was 350. So they have made 15 units for which they will earn a bonus. Please don't put £15 in here. We need to work out the bonus that's paid. The bonus is payable at £2 per unit. So 15 times 2 gives us £30. We don't need 2 decimal places, so we can leave that at 30. Will S. Roscoe receive a team bonus? Did Team A, did they all achieve a bonus? Let's have a look. So Team A all exceeded their targets. So S. Roscoe will earn a team bonus. How much is that team bonus? It says there's a team bonus of £60, which is divided equally between the members of the team. There are 3 people in a team. So £60 divided by 3 gives S. Roscoe their share of that bonus of £20. Can you see you've got to hunt round for the information? It's not necessarily given to you all in a nice, neat order. You've got to look round for the information that you need. Next one then, M cross, basic wage. We know what the basic wage is for a 35-hour week. We've calculated it already. It's £875. M cross made 355 units. So they made 5 units more than the standard, more than the target. So they're going to receive a bonus of £2 for each of those 5 units. So their individual bonus will be £10. Do they get a team bonus? Okay. M cross is in Team B. Team B did not all exceed their target, so there will not be any team bonus payable. Remember that instruction there, if your answer is 0, enter 0. So we must put a 0 in this table. What that tells the system is that I've calculated it, I've looked at it, and I have decided that the answer is 0. I've not just forgotten to answer it. That is my answer. The answer is 0. Okay, we can move on then. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. We should have enough time to finish this, I think. Task 7 is about budget calculations and exception reporting using formulas. So it's telling us it's using formulas, so we can expect to have some spreadsheets in Task 7. First of all, though, we've got to do Part A, which has got some drop-down options for us to choose from. So complete the following statement about the use of budgets. So our partial statement is budgets facilitate something which enables a business to something. So budgets facilitate, well, hopefully it's not excessive spending. Hopefully it's planning, which enables a business to, meet their required objectives. A business certainly shouldn't be any accountant shouldn't be hiding issues. They need to be flagged up, don't they? But meet the required objectives. Moving down then. Business now calls Sharp Repairs Limited, who service vacuum cleaners. Using the information provided in cells A2 to D5, so this is this bit here, A2 to D5, complete the following table. Let's scroll down a bit. Okay, yes, so we've got a table here, still within our Excel format, and it's that table we need to complete. This is different to the earlier Excel task. This is saying formulas must be used for figures entered into cells B10. So B10, B11, D10 and F10, and helpfully those cells have been coloured slightly different colour. They're in sort of a creamy colour there, aren't they? So that is just helpful, isn't it? Just to remind us that we need to put a formula in there, not the numbers themselves. The remaining cells should be completed by entering figures only, so no formulas in those remaining figures. Importantly, we're asked to show adverse variances using a minus sign. Monetary value should be to the nearest whole pound. The variance percentage column has been pre-formatted to 2 decimal places. That's been done for us. We don't need to do that. And then we need to identify whether the variances are adverse or favourable using the drop-down list in cells E10 to E13. Okay, so I'm just going to scroll up so we can get this in the centre. So let's have a look what we need to put into our budget. We can see we've got a budget for revenue, so that's income, and then costs, direct labour, fixed overheads, and then there's a calculation of profit and loss. This is based on a budget of 6,000 units and an actual of 6,000 units. We've got a variance column. We need to say if that variance is adverse or favourable and calculate the percentage variance, except in the highlighted cells where we're going to enter the formula that you would need to do in Excel to calculate that value. So revenue, to calculate the revenue for this period, the budget, we would need to multiply the number of units sold by the selling price. So we can see the number of units sold is in cell B5, and the the selling price of that unit is in cell C2. So I want to multiply B5 with cell C2. So when I'm doing a formula, I always have to start my formula with an equal sign, so Excel knows that I'm typing a formula. So we're going to multiply cell B5. I like to use capital letters when I'm doing cell references. B5 multiplied by cell C2. Okay, now in this example it's calculating the value for me. So what I would do is I'd get my calculator out and let's just double check that that formula has done the calculation that we expected it to do. So 6,000 units times £35. Yeah, £210,000. So my formula has calculated that value correctly. There is some help over in the references section, some formula guidance that tells you just how to, just tells you what to do and what not to do when you're typing formulas. So I would always double check those references and make sure I've not done anything that I shouldn't have done when entering those formulas. Okay, next one down then. Oh, actually, no, let's work across. Let's get all of the revenue row done first of all. So I need to calculate the variance. Okay, so I can see that this business had budgeted to sell £210,000 worth of units. However, the actual sales were 207,000. So I know that this is an adverse variance. Sales are less than expected. So I need my variance calculation to come up with a minus number to indicate this is an adverse variance. So to do that, I am going to take the number in cell C10, so equals C10, and I'm going to subtract from that the budget figure in B10. If I press enter, so that is showing an adverse variance of £3,000, which is what I would expect it to do. It's adverse, so we can select the drop down, double click there. My variance percentage, so the variance percentage is the variance expressed as a percentage of the budget. So my variance is in cell D10. I'm going to divide that by my budget in cell B10, and mustn't forget to multiply by 100 because this is a percentage. So D10, the variance divided by the budget in B10 multiplied by 100. Again, I would just use my calculator to check that that's actually calculated the right percentage. Next one then. We need to calculate the cost of direct labour. Let's have a look what figures we've got. So we know how many hours it took to produce 6,000 units, and we know the cost per hour. So we're going to multiply the number of hours by the cost per hour. So equals cell B3 multiplied by cell C3. So let's just double check that on our calculators. So 1,500 hours, 1,500 hours times by £25. Yeah, 37,500. So that's correct. I don't need to put formulas in now. I can just calculate the variance. Remember, this is a cost variance now. If we look here, our actual cost was less than budget. So that's a favourable variance, isn't it? So we're not expecting to see a negative value here. So my variance here is £2,000. That's the difference, isn't it? It's not negative because our actual figure was less than budget. So when we're doing when we're calculating our cost variances, we will take our budgeted costs and subtract from that our actual cost. If you're doing revenue, it's the other way around. Start with your actual and subtract your budget. So favourable variance there. My variance percentage will be £2,000 divided by 37,500, which is my budget, times by 100, 5.33. Fixed overheads. Actual cost is higher than our budgeted cost. So if we do 55,000 minus 56,000, that gives us a variance, an adverse variance of £1,000, which will indicate with a minus sign. It's an adverse variance, and our variance percentage is minus 1,000 divided by 55,000 times by 100 gives us a percentage variance of minus, let's just pop that up again because we're going to need to do some rounding, 1.81818. So we're rounding to 2 decimal places. So we'll round the second decimal place there. That needs to be rounded up because the third digit there is above 5. So it will be 1.82%. Minus 1.82%. Oh, in actual fact, it's lost my minus sign there, hasn't it? Let's just take that out. So minus 1.82. Okay, and then finally, profit or loss, that's pre-calculated for us. It's a loss, it's an adverse variance of £2,000. We made less profit than expected. So obviously, if we were doing a formula for this, we would start off with the actual and subtract from that the budget in order to see that adverse variance of £2,000. We've made less profit than we wanted to, it's obviously adverse, and the percentage variance has already been done for us. Last thing to do is to identify whether the following descriptions of variances are true or false. An adverse overhead variance could be because office rent costs were negotiated to be cheaper in the year. Okay, so an adverse overhead variance. An adverse overhead variance means that expenses are more or dearer than you expected them to be. They've cost more. So an adverse variance, if you've negotiated the rent cost to be cheaper, that you would expect the cost to be cheaper, not more expensive. So that is false. And then finally, a favourable revenue variance could be due to selling more items, but at a cheaper price. Well, yes, if you sell enough, even if they're cheaper, you could still end up with a favourable revenue variance, couldn't you? So that's true. Okay, so that's it. We've reached the end of the task now. We've completed all 7 tasks. Can you see we're on page 8 of 8 here on the top left-hand side? In the actual exam, make sure you go back, check through every question, every task. We've still got 9 minutes left on the timer here. Go back through every task, make sure that you've put an answer in every box. Double check that number formats are correct. 2 decimal places, whole numbers, zeros in unused cells, etc. Minus signs on adverse variances. Make sure that you have followed all of those instructions. If you've still got time left after that, you can go back and start double checking calculations. You can go back and start checking things like the true false answers. So that's it. That is practice assessment 2 complete. So what you would do then now is you would, in your exam, you will just click on submit assessment top right hand side. However, if you're doing this for revision, you might want to get the model answers up now and check through the model answers before you press submit, or failing that, take some screenshots so you can check them later. We're not going to do that now. Let's just click on submit assessment. Oh, there's one unanswered task. It's allowing me to do an unanswered review there. So page 8, task 7. What didn't I do? Let me just have a look. I know what it is. I haven't clicked on answer. So I must click on answer. That's it. So yes, submit the assessment. Okay, because I hadn't clicked on answer at the end of the task, it's assuming that I haven't actually completed it. So yes, submit the assessment. So we're told the pass mark percentage is 70%. We can see that each task has been completed. We can see the marks awarded for each of those tasks. Okay, however, it doesn't give us the opportunity to review those questions. So as I said, please either check your answers before you press submit or take screenshots of your answers so you can check them against the model answers. Model answers are provided here. So practice assessment mark scheme. I would definitely have a look through this, particularly at the way that the Excel questions are marked. There's lots of different ways of entering formulas, and they've given us some examples of the incorrect formulas that somebody might have entered. So it is definitely a useful exercise. Okay, then I hope you found this video useful. Please get in touch if you have any questions or if you need any support.